There is a town in Pennsylvania where the ground exhales smoke, where the soil beneath your feet stays warm even in January, where cracks in the pavement glow faintly orange after dark, and the air carries the mineral tang of something ancient feeding on itself from below, something that should have been extinguished decades ago, but never was. Not because nobody tried, but because certain men with offices and titles and access to documents that were never intended for public eyes, decided that what burned beneath Centralia was worth more alive than dead. The official account claims it began with a trash fire in May of 1962. A simple, foolish accident. Burning refuse in an old strip mine pit that happened to sit atop one of the most extensive networks of underground anthracite seams in the eastern United States. The fire was set. The garbage burned. And then, according to the official version, the fire was believed to be out. An accident. A miscalculation. One of those things that just happens. But if you speak to the people who actually lived in Centralia, the ones who fled years before the government finally told them they had to, the ones whose children developed respiratory conditions that doctors couldn't explain, the ones whose homes cracked and sank, while local officials issued statements insisting that nothing was structurally wrong, you start to hear a different version. A story about a fire that may have been made possible by decisions taken years before anyone struck a match. About a company that possessed detailed engineering assessments of the underground geology beneath Centralia. Assessments identifying the dump site as a specific risk for fire transmission into the coal seam. Those assessments were submitted to the state government more than a year before the fire started. About state officials who failed to act, or were advised not to act, through the years when intervention was still feasible. And about a decision made somewhere by someone that a community of several thousand people living above a growing underground furnace was a problem that could be managed rather than solved. This is not a tale about ghosts or curses. There is nothing supernatural about what happened in Centralia. That is precisely what makes it so deeply, persistently unsettling. Before we continue with the story of Centralia, Pennsylvania, if you have ever felt that the ground beneath you is less solid than you were told, if you have ever wondered what institutions will sacrifice to protect themselves, when the truth starts burning its way toward the surface, make sure you subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit that notification bell so you never miss one of these deep dives into America's hidden histories. And tell us in the comments what state or city you're listening from tonight. We read every single one, because what happened in Centralia didn't begin in 1962. It began nearly a century before, in the belly of the mountains, where men went underground and learned things about the earth that the earth preferred to keep to itself. To understand Centralia, you have to understand what anthracite coal meant to the people of central Pennsylvania in the second half of the 19th century. It was not simply fuel. It was life itself, the material from which entire communities were built and sustained, the thing that justified the existence of dozens of small towns in the valleys and ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. Unlike the softer bituminous coal found elsewhere, anthracite burned hotter, cleaner, and longer. It was the coal that heated the brownstones of New York City and the townhouses of Philadelphia. It was the coal that powered the factories of the Gilded Age, that made possible the particular form of industrial capitalism that remade the United States in the decades after the Civil War, and the men who controlled the rights to extract it from the earth became, during those years, extraordinarily powerful. The region that would become Columbia County sat atop one of the most extraordinary geological formations in North America, a massive deposit of anthracite running in thick, interconnected veins through the ridges and hollows of the Central Appalachians. Those veins had been worked for generations. Small, independent mining operations had opened shafts and dug tunnels throughout the area during the first half of the 19th century, pulling coal by hand and mule, leaving behind a labyrinthine network of tunnels and chambers that was never comprehensively mapped. When the large coal companies arrived in the post-Civil War period and began systematic industrial extraction, they inherited not only the coal, but also that underground architecture, all its passages and chambers and intersections, its flooded sections and its gassed sections, its sealed entries and its rotted timber supports. The town of Centralia, incorporated in 1866, though settlers had occupied the valley for decades before, sat in a natural bowl between ridges, a compact grid of streets pressed close together, the way towns in coal country always were, as if proximity itself might provide some protection against the particular loneliness of the mountains. By the 1870s, the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company had already begun systematic operations in the area, and the network of tunnels that honeycombed the ground beneath Centralia's streets was growing more extensive every year. The miners who worked those tunnels knew them the way they knew the floors of their own homes. Which passages connected to which, where the ceilings were low, where the air went bad in wet weather, which shafts had been abandoned and sealed with nothing more than a few timbers and a rough fill of ash and dirt. The men who worked those mines were largely immigrants: Welsh, Irish, Lithuanian, Polish, Slovak, Italian. They had come to the Pennsylvania coal regions because the companies had recruited them, sending agents to ports of entry with promises of steady wages and company housing. And they had stayed because the coal had swallowed their fathers and their brothers and their neighbors, and because the coal region was all they knew. They built churches in Centralia, half a dozen denominations crowded into a town that at its peak held around 2,000 souls. They built a school, a post office, a movie theater, taverns, a lunch counter, a hardware store. They built, in other words, a real community, a place with its own texture and its own memory, on ground that was never entirely theirs. A miner named Joseph Kudlak, who worked the Locust Run shaft beginning in 1898 until a roof collapse took 2 of his fingers in 1911, kept a journal that was eventually preserved by his granddaughter and donated to a small historical archive in Bloomsburg. In an entry from the summer of 1903, he wrote something that would read decades later as a kind of unwitting prophecy. The foreman tells us again today to leave the number 7 corridor sealed and to ask no questions about it. He says the gas in there is bad, but I have been at the entrance to that tunnel, and there is no bad air that I can detect. There is only old coal and empty dark, and the sense that whatever is wrong in that place, the company already knows what it is, and does not intend to share the knowledge. What Kudlak had sensed, but lacked the technical vocabulary to fully articulate, was that the geological map of Centralia's underground was more complex and more dangerous than the company had ever disclosed to the miners or the community above them. The veins ran not only deep, but shallow, in some places less than 50 feet beneath the town streets and yards, and those shallow seams connected to deeper ones through the labyrinthine system of old workings left by generations of small-scale extraction. The ground beneath Centralia was, in other words, full of holes, interconnected, partially sealed, partially flooded, partially filled with gases that accumulated in confined spaces. A vast subterranean architecture that no single person had ever mapped in its entirety for decades. That simply meant that living in Centralia involved a particular kind of background unease. The occasional subsidence that cracked a foundation, The sulfur smell that rose from certain patches of yard in wet weather. The mine foremen who discouraged questions and kept their own counsel about what they knew of the underground. People adapted. People in coal country had learned, across generations, to adapt to things that would have been considered intolerable elsewhere. That was part of what it meant to live there. A certain toughness. A certain silence about what was simply the condition of one's life. And then, in the spring of 1962, someone struck a match. The official account of what happened on May 27, 1962, is almost deliberately mundane. Members of the Centralia Borough Council authorized the burning of the town's garbage dump, as they had done in previous years without incident. The dump occupied an old strip mine pit at the edge of town on Langdon Street. A shallow excavation that had been used for waste disposal for some time, unremarkable in the way that municipal dumps in small towns always were. The fire was set, the garbage burned. By all outward appearances, the fire was extinguished after the burning was complete. The council members went home. The borough of Centralia proceeded with its ordinary business. Over the following days, workers noticed that sections of the dump were still smoldering. They applied water. They covered smoldering areas with soil. They returned the next day, and the smoldering continued. This was not at first treated as an unusual situation. Dump fires sometimes lingered, and the standard remedies usually worked within a few days. What no one on the Borough Council knew, and what the state agency responsible for mine safety almost certainly did know, was that the Langdon Street dump had been constructed in a location that posed a specific and documented risk. An engineering assessment commissioned in April of 1961, more than a year before the fire, by the corporate entity holding mineral rights to the coal seams beneath Centralia, had identified the dump site as adjacent to, and in some sections directly above, an unmapped series of old workings that connected to the main seam network. The assessment noted, in careful technical language, that burning operations at the dump site should be conducted under supervision, given the risk of fire transmission to the underlying coal seams. That assessment had been submitted to the state government. It was in a filing cabinet somewhere in Harrisburg, while the Borough Council voted to burn the dump in May of 1962. Nobody told the Borough Council. Nobody sent a memo, or made a telephone call, or posted a notice. Nobody pulled the engineering file and said, "Wait, this location has been identified as a risk," and so the fire found the coal. Not dramatically. Not with an explosion or a visible catastrophe that would have required immediate response. But slowly, invisibly, in the way that underground fires always begin. A thin, unmapped seam along the edge of the pit. The fire followed the seam connected to others. The network of old workings provided passage. The fire moved. Coal seam fires are not like surface fires. They don't roar. They don't produce the visible drama that prompts immediate response. They smolder at temperatures that can exceed 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, while leaving the surface above them looking, to the casual observer, more or less normal. They follow seams wherever the seams lead. Through the dark, through old tunnels, through the complex underground geography that no surface map fully captures. And they are extraordinarily difficult to extinguish once they have established themselves in a seam system. Particularly when that system is as extensive and as poorly mapped as the one beneath Centralia. In the weeks and months following the May fire, the State Department of Mines and Mineral Industries received reports from inspectors who had visited the dump site. The reports noted ongoing subsurface combustion. They noted that standard suppression methods were not producing the expected results. They noted that the fire appeared to be spreading beyond the boundaries of the dump pit. And then, for a period that would later become the subject of considerable scrutiny. No decisive action on those reports simply did not materialize. The reasons for that inaction bring us to the part of the Centralia story that the official histories tend to narrate as bureaucratic inefficiency, interagency coordination failures, budget constraints, the challenges of responding to an unprecedented situation. Those explanations are not entirely wrong. They are simply incomplete. In 1962, the coal industry in Pennsylvania was in a state of managed decline. The great anthracite companies that had dominated the region for decades had largely completed the extraction of the most accessible seams and had pivoted to protecting and monetizing what remained of their underground assets. The mineral rights beneath Centralia, the legal ownership of the coal still in the ground, were held by a corporate entity that was itself a successor to one of the original mining companies, now part of a larger energy conglomerate based in Philadelphia. Those rights had value even for coal that was currently inaccessible. In an era of energy uncertainty, the prospect of future extraction from those seams was worth something to the men who held the rights. And the value of those rights was directly affected by what happened on the surface above them. Several of the men in positions most relevant to a rapid response to the Centralia fire had professional histories, and in some cases professional relationships, that connected them to the coal industry they were nominally regulating. And this was not unusual in Pennsylvania at the time. The revolving door between industry and the agencies overseeing it was not secret. It was simply the established order, the way things had worked for decades in a state where coal was king, and the people who ran coal were woven through the fabric of government and civic life at every level. Extinguishing the fire in its early stages would have required excavating the affected area of the dump, removing the burning material, and isolating the seam entry points to prevent reignition. Early engineering estimates that exist in the state record, put the cost of such an intervention at somewhere between the $175,000 and $400,000. Significant, but not catastrophic, and not the kind of expenditure that should have been difficult to justify when the alternative was allowing a fire to spread through the underground seam network beneath an inhabited community. The state hesitated. Federal agencies were consulted. A working group was formed. Studies were commissioned. More time passed. By 1965, 3 years after the initial fire, the underground combustion had moved well beyond the dump site. Engineers who examined the area for the state that year produced reports that used language like significant expansion and continued spread and immediate intervention needed. A man named Harold her formal assessment that autumn, noting specifically that the fire front has organic recline within the Tarkam that he was in them was within them of him was no but through nothing with vagueness and more than immediately fuel to the old and was really just needs huge and weak church. That report sat in a filing cabinet in Harrisburg for the better part of a year, by the time money was actually allocated for a serious suppression attempt. A trenching operation designed to cut off the fire's path. The fire had already moved around and beyond the trench before the work was completed. The first major federal intervention came in 1969. By then, the fire had been burning for 7 years, had spread through multiple seams, and had placed itself in a position where extinguishing it would have required an effort of a scale and cost that neither the state nor the federal government was prepared to commit. What had been a containable local problem in 1962 was, by 1969, a catastrophe in slow motion. The surface of Centralia was still intact. The houses were still standing. The school was still open. Children still walked to church on Sunday mornings along streets that, from above, looked more or less as they had always looked. But below the surface in the dark, The fire was moving through the seams with the patience of something that had no need to hurry. The people of Centralia did not know the full extent of what was moving beneath them. They would spend the next decade and a half finding out, one frightening discovery at a time. There is a tendency in the retrospective telling of the Centralia story to focus on the institutional failures. The documents filed and ignored, the reports produced and shelved, the agencies that studied while the fire spread. That focus is warranted. But focusing on it exclusively risks losing something equally important: the texture of what it was actually like to live in Centralia during the years between the fire's beginning and the evacuation's end. The answer, in ways that are simultaneously mundane and heartbreaking, is that life in Centralia during those years was recognizable. People went to work, children went to school, the churches held their services and their suppers and their annual fairs. The remaining storefronts stayed open as long as they could. Neighbors visited neighbors. People argued at borough council meetings about exactly the things that people argue about at borough council meetings everywhere: road maintenance, budget allocations, the particular frustrations of local governance. All of this continued with varying degrees of normalcy above a fire that was slowly making the ground they stood on uninhabitable. A teacher named Margaret Petrosky, who had taught at the Centralia School from 1958 until it was consolidated with a neighboring district in 1982, gave an oral history interview to a researcher from Penn State's Oral History Project in 1989. She described the experience of those years with a precision that has the ring of something that has been carefully thought through over a long time. The strange thing about it was how ordinary most days were. You would come in the morning, and you would teach, and the children would be there, and you would go home. And then sometimes something would happen that reminded you. A crack in the road outside that hadn't been there the week before, or the smell in the lower hallway that we couldn't get rid of no matter what we did, or one of the children coming in and telling you that their mother had been sick again. And you would think, how is this ordinary? How have we made this ordinary? But we did. People do. What Petrosky described. That accommodation of the extraordinary within the framework of the ordinary is one of the documented psychological responses to chronic environmental threat. When people cannot immediately remove themselves from a dangerous situation, they develop a form of normalization that allows daily life to continue. It is not denial exactly. The residents of Centralia were not, by any documented account, unaware of the fire. They were acutely aware of it, but awareness without the ability to act on it eventually settles into a kind of background hum. And so daily life continued because it had to, because the alternative was paralysis, because the children still needed to be fed and the bills still needed to be paid, and the furnace still needed to be coaxed into life on February mornings. Even if that furnace sat in a basement that was noticeably warmer than it should have been. The social life of the town during those years had a quality that survivors describe with remarkable consistency. A heightened intensity of community connection, alongside a growing awareness of impermanence. People came together in the churches and the remaining taverns and each other's kitchens, with an awareness, often unspoken, that what they were maintaining together was fragile in ways that communities built on solid ground did not have to confront in the same way. Birthday parties and baptisms and Sunday dinners took on an additional weight. Arguments about small things, the kind of arguments that fill any community's life, the minor irritations and disagreements that normally resolve and are forgotten, had a different quality in Centralia during those years. Because everyone involved understood at some level that the community they were arguing within might not be there in the same form much longer. Father Bernard Cherney, who served as pastor of one of Centralia's Catholic parishes from 1971 through the final years of the evacuation, described his experience of those years in a memoir published privately and available in the Bloomsburg Historical Collection. He wrote, "I have been present at a great many deathbeds in my ministry, and I recognize now that what I was witnessing in Centralia during those years was something structurally similar. The particular quality of time that belongs to a life that knows it is ending, where each ordinary moment carries a weight it wouldn't have in circumstances of apparent permanence. People in Centralia during those years loved their community with an unusual fierceness, and they fought for it with an unusual tenacity. And when they finally had to leave, the grief was of a kind I had not encountered before. Not the grief of bereavement, but the grief of a community that had been deprived of the future it should have had." By the mid-1970s, Centralia had already begun to change in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to miss for anyone who had known the town before. The population was declining steadily in the way of a community that has begun to sense something wrong without being able to name it precisely. Young people left after high school and didn't come back. Families who could afford to move quietly did. The storefronts on Center Street emptied one by one. The hardware store closed. The movie house closed. The lunch counter contracted its hours and then its ambitions. The fire made itself known in different ways in different parts of town. In some yards, the grass had died in patches, brown ovals in otherwise green lawns. The soil beneath them warmed to the touch in December, when the ground should have been frozen hard. In some basements, a smell collected in corners and along floor joints, sulfurous mineral, the smell of something old burning deep underground. Carbon monoxide, colorless and unscented, accumulated in enclosed spaces at concentrations that gave people headaches and slowed their thinking and made the air feel thick and wrong in ways that were hard to articulate to someone who hadn't experienced it. In at least a handful of cases that exist in the documentary record, people lost consciousness in their own homes. A physician named Dr. Raymond Selecki, who had grown up in a neighboring town and had maintained a practice serving the coal region community for years, began noticing patterns among his Centralia patients in the early 1970s that troubled him deeply. He documented elevated rates of respiratory illness among residents of certain blocks. Illness that did not respond normally to standard treatment and that seemed correlated with duration of residence rather than with individual health history. He documented neurological symptoms consistent with chronic low-level carbon monoxide exposure, fatigue, persistent headaches, cognitive dulling that patients described as a kind of ongoing mental fog, mood disturbances that developed in people with no prior history of such symptoms. He documented, in one section of town that sat above a portion of the seam network where the fire had been active the longest, a pattern of pregnancy complications that he could not attribute to any cause other than the air quality in that neighborhood. Dr. Selecki submitted his findings to the Pennsylvania Department of Health in 1977. He received an acknowledgement letter. He submitted a follow-up with additional documentation in 1979. He received another acknowledgement letter. In a letter written to a colleague in March of 1980, he described his frustration with a precision that still reads as striking. I have come to understand that the people of this community are, in the calculus of whoever is making these decisions, an acceptable loss, not in any policy document, nothing written explicitly, but in the pattern of what happens to every request for action. It is studied. The study generates recommendations. The recommendations generate further study, and the families living above the fire breathe the air and wait for something to change. The story of Walter Gasparetti gives that abstraction a particular human face. Walter had been born in Centralia in 1931, the son of an Italian immigrant miner who had come to the coal region before the First World War and never left. Walter had grown up in the town, had married a woman named Rose Brennan, whose people had been in the valley since the 1880s, and had spent his working life as a plumber serving the local community. He knew the town the way you can only know a place you have inhabited across a lifetime. Every house, every basement, every furnace that needed coaxing in February. He was, by any measure, a man who understood his environment. In 1973, Walter noticed that his basement was warmer than it should be. Not alarmingly at first, but distinctly, persistently warmer in a way that did not respond to any obvious mechanical explanation. He installed a carbon monoxide detector on the advice of a neighbor who worked with the mine rescue service and had begun telling people quietly that they should take precautions. The detector triggered on several occasions in the early morning hours when the house was closed up. Walter went to the Borough Council. He wrote to the state office in Bloomsburg. He sent a letter to the Department of Environmental Resources in Harrisburg. He was told the situation was being monitored. He was told his readings were within parameters under review. He was told, in the bureaucratic language designed to convey attentiveness while committing to nothing, that the appropriate agencies were aware of his concerns. In the winter of 1976, Rose Gasparetti found her husband on the floor of his basement unresponsive, where he had gone to check on a pipe. When help arrived and the basement was ventilated and measurements were taken, the carbon monoxide concentration in that space was found to be approximately 3 times the level that the state's own standards classified as immediately dangerous to human life. Walter survived. The damage to his heart and his lungs was not reversible. When Rose testified before a state legislative committee in 1983, 7 years later, by which point the evacuation of Centralia was well underway, she brought the letters. She had kept every letter Walter had written to every agency and every form response those agencies had sent back. She spread the papers on the table in front of the committee members. Years of correspondence. A documentary record of a man who had tried every channel available to him to communicate that something was wrong beneath his home, and who had received, in return, a succession of letters that acknowledged his concern without acting on it. He knew, she said quietly to the committee. He knew for years before it nearly killed him. Every person he contacted, every official, every agency, they knew too. What I want answered is not why the fire is still burning. What I want answered is why they let it burn. The committee received her testimony. A report was issued. Recommendations were made. The fire continued to burn. If this story is reaching you the way it reaches us, every time we go back through the record, if the weight of what these people experienced is settling into you, in that particular way that true horror does, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the like button to support this work, and leave us your thoughts below. Do you think what happened in Centralia was negligence, or was it something more deliberate? We want to know. By 1981, the fire had been burning for nearly 2 decades. The state had acknowledged its existence, had attempted several suppression operations that the fire had circumvented, had commissioned studies and formed committees and allocated funds that were spent without producing the outcome they were supposed to produce. The residents who remained in Centralia had developed the particular psychology of people who live with a chronic, unresolved danger, a mixture of adaptation and vigilance, of normalizing things that should not be normal. And then, on the morning of February 14th, 1981, the fire introduced itself in a way that could not be explained away or filed in a cabinet. Todd Domboski was 12 years old. He was playing in the backyard of his grandmother's house on Locust Avenue. A cold winter morning, the ground dusted with snow. The wisps of steam rising from certain spots in the yard were a familiar sight. Residents of that block had grown accustomed to them, had stopped remarking on them, had incorporated them into their understanding of what their neighborhood looked like in winter. Todd walked across a patch of ground that looked, as far as he could tell, exactly like the ground around it. The earth gave way beneath him. A sinkhole opened without warning. The surface layer of soil, undermined and desiccated by the heat and gases rising from the fire below, simply gave way under the weight of a 12-year-old boy. The hole that opened was 4 feet across. It deepened rapidly as the loose material at its edges continued to give way. The depth would later be estimated at somewhere between 50 and 150 feet. From the darkness below, carbon monoxide and heat rose in a column that was immediately visible as a rush of warm, fall air against the February cold. Todd survived because his cousin Dennis was nearby and reached him immediately, gripping his arm while Todd hung in the opening, and the earth continued to crumble around them, extending the hole outward and downward. Others arrived and helped pull him out. The exposure to the gases rising from the seam below was significant enough to require medical attention. If he had been alone, if his cousin had not been close enough, if the hole had been another foot wider when Dennis grabbed for him, he would have died. The carbon monoxide levels in the gases rising from below were, as measured shortly after the incident, at concentrations that would render a person unconscious within minutes and dead within a quarter hour. The photographs of the hole circulated nationally. The image was stark and undeniable. A gap in an ordinary backyard, steam rising from the darkness below, the edge of a snow-dusted lawn crumbling at the rim. Congressional representatives demanded briefings. The journalists who had been covering the Centralia story for years finally had a picture that required no explanation. A 12-year-old boy had nearly disappeared into the burning ground on Valentine's Day, and this particular photograph was one that institutions could not produce a study group to manage. The evacuation process, which would unfold over the following decade, was set in motion by a 12-year-old boy who went outside to play on a winter morning and found that the ground where he stood was not what it appeared to be. This is one of the precise, specific ironies of the Centralia story, that the moment of maximum visibility was also the most personal, the most human, the hardest to abstract. Not a graph of underground temperatures, not an engineering assessment. A child, a hole, a cousin close enough to grab his arm. In the spring of 1997, a doctoral candidate at Penn State University working on a dissertation about mid-century coal industry regulation made a discovery in the state archives in Harrisburg that stopped him cold. His name was Michael Fury. He was researching the regulatory framework governing strip mining in the post-war period and had been working through a large, imperfectly organized collection of files from the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries, the predecessor agency to the Department of Environmental Resources. The collection covered decades of regulatory activity and had not been systematically reviewed since its original deposit in the archive. Near the back of one filing cabinet, misfiled under a heading for Schuylkill County, rather than Columbia County, Fury found a folder containing documents dated from 1961 and 1962. Engineering assessments prepared by a consulting firm working for the corporate entity that held mineral rights to the coal seams beneath Centralia. Detailed, technical, precise. They described the underground geology of the area with a thoroughness that made clear the commissioning company had invested serious resources in understanding what lay beneath the town. One section of those assessments addressed the Langdon Street dump site specifically. The language was hedged, the language of engineers, who understood they were producing a document that might someday be reviewed by lawyers. But the substance was unmistakable. The dump occupied a former strip mine pit. That pit was adjacent to, and in several places directly above, a series of old workings that connected to the main seam network beneath the township. Any burning operations at this site should be conducted with specific precautions and under qualified supervision, given the risk of fire transmission to the underlying coal formations. The assessment was dated April 1961, more than a year before the fire. Fury sat in the archive reading room for a long time after he understood what he was looking at. He read through the documents again. He identified the state agency filing code on the folder, which indicated it had been received and logged by the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries. Received, logged, filed. And then, apparently, never acted upon in any way that prevented the Borough Council from authorizing the burning of that same dump site 14 months later. The Borough Council had no access to the mineral rights assessments submitted to the state agency. They were a local governing body, making a routine municipal decision. They did not know that an engineering firm had told the state government more than a year before that burning at Langdon Street posed a specific and identifiable risk. They could not have known. That information was in the wrong room, in the wrong cabinet, in the wrong folder, in an archive in a city 60 miles away. Fury contacted the State Archives Administration. He contacted a historian at Bloomsburg University who had written about Centralia. He contacted a journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer who had covered the Centralia story extensively in the 1980s. The journalist made inquiries. She contacted the Department of Environmental Resources, the State Attorney General's office, and the corporate successor to the entity that had commissioned the 1961 assessments. The response from the state was that the documents were historical materials outside any applicable statute of limitations. The response from the corporate successor was that its legal team had reviewed the matter and had no comment on historical documents. The response from the Attorney General's office was that no investigation was warranted based on the information provided. The documents were described in a sidebar article in the Inquirer in 1998. It ran on page B7. There was no follow-up investigation. There was no legislative hearing. There was no formal inquiry into how an engineering assessment identifying a specific fire risk at a specific location had been received by the state and then filed without any action to prevent the risk it described. The fire beneath Centralia was still burning when the article ran. It is still burning now. The emptying of Centralia did not happen in the swift, decisive way of emergency evacuations. It happened the way that slow catastrophes always resolve, unevenly, incompletely, with the people most affected carrying the weight of decisions that were made at a distance by institutions that would not be living with the consequences. Federal relocation funds began arriving in 1984, following years of congressional attention and the sustained advocacy of a small group of residents who had, by that point, become practiced navigators of the machinery of government response. Families began accepting buyout offers. Some left with relief, grateful for any resolution to a situation that had been unresolved for more than 2 decades. Some left with fury, the particular controlled anger of people who understood they were being compensated for something that should never have happened at all. Some held out for better terms, arguing with federal agents over property valuations in kitchens, where the carbon monoxide detectors had been sounding for years, and a few simply refused. Refused on principle, or from necessity, or from the profound human unwillingness to accept that the life you have built and the place where you have buried your dead is simply going to be purchased out from under you at a price set by the people responsible for the situation in the first place. A woman named Eleanor Whitoshek, whose family had been in Centralia for 3 generations, refused the first 2 buyout offers and stayed on Locust Avenue until 1992. She had raised her children in that house. She had buried her husband from the church 2 blocks away. She had worked for decades at the lunch counter that had closed when the grocery store closed, when the hardware store closed. She knew the town in the intimate, accumulated way that only long habitation makes possible. In an interview given to a Bloomsburg newspaper, shortly before she finally accepted relocation, she said, "They keep telling us the town is finished. But who decided that? Who decided when we were done? It wasn't us. We didn't decide to have the dump where it was. We didn't decide how the state responded. We didn't decide any of this. We were just here. And now they want to pay us for what was ours and call it settled." Her words contained something that went beyond personal grievance, because she was right in a precise and documentable way. The people of Centralia had not decided to build a garbage dump on ground above unmapped mine workings. They had not decided to have the state in possession of an engineering assessment, identifying the dump as a fire risk without acting on that assessment. They had not decided to have officials who delayed intervention through the years when the fire was still containable. These decisions had been made for them by systems and institutions operating with interests and information that the residents of Centralia did not share and were not told about. By 1992, the population of the town had fallen below 100. By 2000, it was fewer than 20. The zip code 77927 was discontinued by the United States Postal Service in 2002, a bureaucratic confirmation that the town, for official purposes, no longer existed. The street signs were removed. The roads that had served the departed neighborhoods were torn up. The property acquired through eminent domain was left to whatever process of slow reclamation, the vegetation, and the elements, and the heat rising from below would perform upon it. The church where Father Cherney had ministered through the years of crisis, St. Ignatius on Wood Street, was one of the last structures to be demolished. The former congregation, scattered across multiple communities in the region, had maintained a connection to the building long after most of its members had left Centralia. When demolition finally came, there were people who drove hours to be present, to stand on the sidewalk outside the building, where they had been baptized and confirmed and married, where they had buried their dead, and watch it come down. The ground beneath them, even then, was warm. Just when we thought we understood the full picture of what happened in Centralia, just when the scale of the loss seemed to have been fully established, new questions began to surface about what the fire was still doing and what some people may have always wanted it to do. There is a question that runs beneath every account of Centralia, beneath the official histories and the journalistic investigations and the academic analyses, beneath all the documents that have been reviewed and all the testimonies that have been recorded. It is a question that none of the official investigations has ever fully answered. A question that the people who lived in Centralia asked themselves and asked the men in offices and agencies who came to meet with them and take notes and produce reports, and never received a satisfying response to. The question is this: who benefited from the fire continuing to burn? To answer it, You have to think about the underground in a different way than the official story encourages. The coal seams beneath Centralia still contained substantial deposits of anthracite at the time the fire started in 1962. The most accessible seams had been worked, but there were deeper and more extensive deposits that the technology and economics of mid-century extraction had left in place. Those deposits, the mineral rights to that coal, were held by corporate entities that were, by the early 1960s, subsidiaries of larger energy conglomerates. The value of those rights was real, even for coal that was currently inaccessible, in an era when energy economics were volatile and the future of coal was uncertain, but not foreclosed. The holders of mineral rights beneath an inhabited community sat on an asset whose development was complicated by the presence of the people living above it. You cannot strip mine beneath a community. You cannot excavate the shallow seams beneath a residential neighborhood without relocating the residents above them. The legal and political obstacles to large-scale surface disruption of an inhabited area are enormous. Eminent domain proceedings, community opposition, media attention, the full weight of a community's claim to the ground it has occupied for generations. These obstacles are not insurmountable, but they are costly. They take time. They generate scrutiny. They produce the kind of public conflict that companies and the officials connected to them prefer to avoid. But a fire changes the calculus. A fire that makes the surface uninhabitable, that causes the government to declare the ground above the coal too dangerous for human presence, to buy out the residents, to demolish the structures, and to retire the zip code. A fire that does all of that removes the obstacles. It clears the surface. It empties the land of the legal and moral complexity that inhabited land carries. It transforms a town into a depopulated zone, where the only remaining question is the industrial one. No document has ever surfaced explicitly stating that the fire was permitted or encouraged to spread as a strategy for clearing the surface above a coal deposit. The historical record does not support a claim of deliberate arson or conscious conspiracy to this specific effect. What the historical record does support, with considerable documentation, is a pattern of decisions, each individually explicable by its own institutional logic, that had the cumulative effect of allowing the fire to grow from a containable local problem into a catastrophe that ultimately emptied an entire community. The 1961 engineering assessment filed and ignored the years of delayed intervention, during which the fire moved from the dump site into the seam network. The suppression operations that were underfunded and ultimately ineffective, the decade and a half during which families lived above the expanding fire, while agencies studied and committees met and reports were issued and filed. The documents that sat in the wrong cabinet in the Harrisburg archive for 36 years. Each of these things, taken alone, can be attributed to ordinary institutional failure. Bureaucratic inertia, budget constraints, the normal friction of government response to an unprecedented situation. But the pattern of them, the particular way in which failure accumulated at every stage, where success was still possible, and then the particular way in which the aftermath of that failure served certain interests very well. That pattern is harder to attribute entirely to simple incompetence. The people who built Centralia and worked the mines and raised their children above the seams did not have the power to shape that pattern. They had the power to write letters and attend hearings and testify before committees and bring their correspondence and spread it on tables in front of the men who had failed them and ask, very quietly and very specifically, "Why did you let it burn?" None of those men ever gave a satisfying answer. Geologists who have modeled the Centralia fire estimate that, based on the volume of coal remaining in the affected seams and the rate of historical consumption. The fire could burn for another 100 to 250 years from today. There are children alive right now who will not live to see the Centralia fire go out. They will grow up, grow old, build lives, and the fire will still be there when they are gone, burning in the dark beneath the hills of Columbia County, patient in the way that geological processes are patient, indifferent to everything that has happened on the surface above it. The town itself is a kind of ghost, not in the supernatural sense, but in the very real, very physical sense of a place that exists in the structures of official documentation, without existing on the ground. The street grid is still visible from the air. The intersections, the block patterns, the lots where houses stood before the demolition crews came. The vegetation has worked its way through the old foundations. The cemetery is still there, its stones still standing above ground that is warm to the touch, where steam rises on cold mornings through the grass between the grave markers. A small number of people, fewer than 10 by the most recent available counts, remain. They live under an agreement with the state. They may stay in their homes for the duration of their lives, after which the properties revert to Commonwealth ownership. It is, depending on your perspective, either a recognition of something that could not be taken from them, or the final act in a very long process of managed erasure. The last people standing on ground the state has already declared does not exist as a community. If you walk through what remains of Centralia on a cold morning, and people do walk there, drawn by the strangeness of it, by the steam rising from earth that should be frozen, by the snow, free patches on the hillsides where the heat below keeps the ground clear. You can feel the warmth through the soles of your boots. You can smell it, that mineral, ancient smell of coal burning deep and slow. The earth beneath you is alive in a way that has nothing human about it, and yet it is entirely the product of human decisions. Every degree of warmth in that ground, every wisp of steam, every crack in what used to be a road, the result of choices made by specific men in specific offices, for reasons that were never fully disclosed to the people who lived above. Eleanor Wojtaszek is gone. Walter Gasparetti is gone. Dr. Raymond Selecki is gone. Harold Tresize, who filed the 1965 report that sat in a cabinet for a year, is almost certainly gone. The men who received the 1961 engineering assessment and did nothing with it are gone. The lawyers who reviewed the liability exposure and advised their clients accordingly are gone. The fire remains. And somewhere in the archives of the Commonwealth, in the collections that no dissertation student has yet happened to look through, in the files that were correctly filed and have therefore attracted no special attention, and in the boxes that were sealed when certain departments were reorganized and haven't been opened since. There may be documents that would tell us more precisely what was known, and when, and what was decided. Documents that would put names and dates and institutional affiliations to the pattern of decisions that turned a garbage fire into a 60-year catastrophe. We don't have those documents. We have what the record has given us: the 1961 assessment, the delayed suppression attempts, the letters that Walter Gasparetti sent, and the form responses he received, Rose Gasparetti's testimony, and the pile of correspondence she laid on the table before the Legislative Committee, the sidebar on page B7 of the Philadelphia Inquirer, the children who grew up breathing the air of a town that was burning from below, whose health history was documented by a physician who could not get the state to investigate his findings. We have the ground itself, warm in January, steaming in winter cold, cracked in ways that tell the story of what burns below, indifferent to every administrative decision made above it. This is what Centralia shows us, that the most consequential disasters are rarely simple. They are the product of accumulated decisions made by systems that rarely face consequences for their choices, affecting communities that had no say in the decisions that shaped their fate. The fire in Centralia is geological now, beyond human intervention at any reasonable scale. But the fire's history is human, thoroughly and specifically human, and the record of it has never been fully reckoned with. What do you think? Do you believe the full truth of what happened in Centralia has ever been told? Do you think the people who made those decisions, the ones who received that assessment in 1961 and filed it, the ones who read Tresize's 1965 report and sat on it for a year, the ones who received Walter Gasparetti's letters and sent form responses, do you think any of them understood, in those moments, what they were setting in motion? Leave your comment below. We read every one, and your thoughts genuinely shape where we take these stories next. If this kind of deep historical investigation is what you came to this channel for, the stories that institutions prefer to leave buried, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The next story is already waiting. And the ground beneath it, as always, is warmer than it should be.